Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started on the OWPP Watershed Protection Program 5-year update. I'm Kevin Fraber. I'm the Wastewater Operations Manager at the treatment plant. The OWPP is managed by the wastewater treatment plant for the city of Oconomowoc. The Oconomowoc Watershed Protection Program falls under the WPDS permit of the wastewater treatment plant, and the first annual report is due the end of January. The mastermind of the OWPP is Tom Steinbach, the previous operation manager of the wastewater treatment plant. Tom was the manager of the wastewater plant for 26 years. Tom is the OWPP advisor and helps run the OWPP through Tall Pines. Please welcome Tom Steinbach.
Good morning.
Tom, you're muted. You're muted still.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so let's start over. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Kevin. I don't know if I'd call myself a mastermind or not, but it sure has been a pleasure to be working on this program and working with all of our partners throughout the last 5 years. We have taken 5 years of work in the watershed and condensed it down into this 2-hour program. So forgive us if we have missed someone to mention or missed some of our events, but I think we did a pretty good job of cooking it all down into this presentation for you this morning. Before we get started, I want to just go through a couple logistical things. We encourage your questions this morning throughout the program, and we ask that you use the basically a button at the bottom in the chat session. So toward the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat button in the middle of the toolbar, and just feel free to enter your questions. And we have 2 people in the background working today to make this all happen. Chris Gutschenritter and Beth Hafer-Jazo, and they will be handling the questions as they come in and filtering those to us as we can get to those during the presentation. So if for some reason you don't see your question answered right away, just hang in there, we'll get to it. So with that, after our presentations at about 1 o'clock, we are going to take a break, and we'll be putting on some very pertinent videos at that point of our program projects and some things that are happening through Tall Pines. So we encourage you to hang around for that. And then we'll go into a Q&A session after that, kind of a general discussion time. And Daryl and I, and possibly Susan, will be available from that point on. As long as you guys have questions and want to hang on, I think we're here for the duration. So feel free to enter any questions at that point. So with that, I would like to start the program with a brief overview, next slide, of how we got here and why we're really into this program in the first place. Phosphorus has been recognized as a nutrient in watersheds and in excessive amounts since the 1970s. But phosphorus is something that we all need. Every living organism in our earth needs phosphorus. However, like a lot of things, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So we are diligently working to reduce phosphorus in our watershed, and we do that by improving soil health, reducing erosion, and working with all of our partners up and down the watershed in that effort. So in the 70s, 80s, we were ramping up treatment plants for reducing phosphorus at that point already. But in the 90s, we really started to get serious about it, and we started to do what we call TMDL studies. TMDL stands for total maximum daily load. So the first major watershed in the state of Wisconsin was the Rock River watershed that was studied for a TMDL reduction plan. So next slide, please. So the city of Oconomowoc received its preliminary TMDL reduction limits in the early 2000s, around 2011, 2012. So from 2013 through 2014, the city had to make a pretty monumental decision. And that decision was to either pour millions of dollars into its treatment facility to reduce the phosphorus load to the Oconomowoc River even further than it had been reducing it for years and decades, or work in the watershed starting from Slinger all the way down to Ixonia. So instead of working in a 6 square mile area, we would be working in 131 square miles. So this is a big decision the city had to make. But through a lot of analysis and careful looks at what we had to do and what we were required to do through our WPDS permit, as Kevin mentioned, we eventually went to the watershed program versus the treatment plant program, although some improvements are being made there as well. Next slide, please. So like a lot of things, dollars drive decisions, right? So to do the improvements at the treatment plant, we were looking at about $15 million over 5 years, instead of in the watershed doing reductions in phosphorus, and our total is estimated to be around 5 million. So that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, though, is what the benefits were to the watershed. And we saw tremendous benefits to the watershed and to the lakes within the city as a result of going with the watershed approach. If we had gone with the treatment plant only approach, only the waters downstream of the city of Oconomowoc would have been improved. The water quality coming into Oconomowoc through the watershed would have been completely up to the control of other municipalities, partners, and entities above the city. So we would have had little control over that. So there was a tremendous, really a tremendous look at how this would improve water quality coming into the city. And it was really a slam dunk at that point to go with the watershed approach. Next slide. So adaptive management is a program that allows communities to work in the watershed. As long as they're a WPDS permit holder, they're allowed to go into an adaptive management program. And the city worked fast track to attain its approval for this adaptive management program in September of 2015. We were one of the first adaptive management programs approved for the state of Wisconsin and really across the country. So the OWPP was born in September of 2015, and we're proud to be engaged in this program, and we'll be looking forward to working with the DNR and the EPA and the NRCS in the next 15 years. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are maybe not as familiar as some, the Oconomowoc River watershed lies on the east side of the Rock River watershed. And this is a map of that. Madison would be over on the west side. Horicon Marsh would be in the upper reaches of this watershed. Next slide. Zooming in now on the watershed itself, up towards the top of the map is Slinger, Highway 60. And then towards the bottom is the town of Ixonia, where our point of compliance is, and where the Oconomowoc River connects with the Rock River. Next slide. So zooming in further then, this is the point where the Oconomowoc River actually flows into the Rock River. And our levels of phosphorus were estimated to be 0.09 milligrams per liter in 2015. And our target level What we must accomplish during this adaptive management period of 15 years is 0.075 milligrams per liter. So these are very small numbers, but it's considered that 0.075 is a safe value for phosphorus in terms of protecting the environment and reducing the growth of algae. Next slide. So a little bit about the rock or the watershed itself. It's almost half agricultural, 20% wetland, 14% forest, 49 miles long, 17 lakes, 83,000 acres or 131 square miles. And in 2015, it was estimated that there was 3,000 agricultural related animal units in the watershed. Next slide. Watershed health. The Oconomowoc watershed is actually in pretty good shape. There's many, many watersheds that are in much worse shape. The Oconomowoc River itself is not what's considered to be an impaired stream. However, we have 3 impaired tributary streams, Flynn Creek, Mason Creek, and Battle Creek, and we have 5 impaired lakes in the watershed. So impaired means that the water body is not meeting its intended uses for recreational purposes, such as fishing and swimming. And that impairment can be from a number of different things: high bacteria, low dissolved oxygen, high phosphorus, and high chemical constituents such as mercury or even PCBs. Next slide. So again, the Oconomowoc River is a beautiful river. It's not impaired itself. Great place to canoe. Daryl and I have canoed this stretch. We've canoed a lot of the other stretches through our paddle events over the last 5 years. Next slide. Another example of the river as it flows through Oconomowoc. And the next slide, please. So what we're going to describe to you today is what we feel is a great example of collaboration. We've got so many different partners in this program that are putting forth a lot of work into this, and it's been a great experience so far, and we've seen some definite improvements. We're going to talk about our monitoring later on, which will give you a feel for where we're at with phosphorus today versus where we were at 5 years ago. So with that, we'll look at our agenda for today. Next slide.
Hey, Tom, just to interrupt real quick, we did have one question come in about where's that compliance measurement taken? The per liter load of phosphorus, where do we measure that?
Okay, right now we're currently measuring that at Northside Drive, which is a few turns in the river up from where the river actually connects with the Rock River. And that is considered our compliance point at this time. And I'll talk about that a little bit later because there's some things going on at that confluence that are very important to the program. Okay, so our agenda today is going to include our agricultural best management practices that are in place. We're going to talk about our Farmers for Lake Country group, which is our farmer leadership group that we've coupled with since day one of this program. Talk about city stormwater programs, our river and stream projects, talk about our monitoring data, give you an example of a couple of our lakes in the watershed in terms of what their characteristics are and how they've been affected by the last 5 years. Recognize our partners and talk about what's next, and then we'll take our break and we'll come back for our Q&A session. So at this time, I want to turn it over to Daryl Smith. Daryl is our program director, and I've been working with Daryl now for 5 years. Daryl was hired on right after we were approved for the adaptive management program in 2015. And Daryl has brought a tremendous amount of expertise to this program. And I have to say that we wouldn't be here today where we are without having Daryl on board. So Daryl, I'm going to turn it over to you for the ag section of this program.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted and we'll give this a go. Someone interrupt me if you can't hear me. Forgive the process here of, we'd love this to be a little more interactive, but hopefully using that chat process. And if we don't get to your questions in stream, to be able to talk about at the very end of the Q&A would be a good way to go about this, to make this as interactive as possible. Just as a side note, we are recording this. So if for some reason you can't stay for the entire presentation, no problem. You can get a link and catch it later, and even catch us an answer to your question in the Q&A if that happens. So, you know, stay tuned as far as that goes as well. So, as Tom mentioned, 46% of the watershed is an agricultural production. And so if we're going to take a watershed-wide approach, it's really important to include agricultural producers, and a lot of impact can be had by small changes made across broad acreage. So a large portion of the work that I've been doing has been focused on agricultural initiatives and partnering with farmers and landowners to keep nutrients on site and in their soil as opposed to in the surface water. I'd like to ask for Chris to throw up a survey question. We're going to do a couple of survey questions along the way. You might see this come in from the right side of your screen. Actually, I've not seen this happen before myself. So you can answer it. And if you don't answer it, you can also just ignore it and it will eventually disappear, so I'm told. But we wanted to get some feedback along the way from you. So next slide, please. As by way of background about farming in general, I'm not a farmer myself. I have a lot of respect for the work that farmers do. And I think it's helpful to keep some background things around farming in mind when I approach farmers and we talk about farming and different ways it impacts the landscape. Farming is by nature high risk, with many variables that the farmer has little control over, or some case no control over. Margins are low. So imagine investing a lot of time and money in something with a low margin of return and a high degree of risk. So it's not necessarily what you would call a solid business proposition, but farmers are tough and they're determined and really are exceptional in what they do in managing variables like weather. So whether it's drought or in recent decade, much higher volumes of precipitation coming in, disease, whether it's a fungus, a pest like a small roundworm, or, oh, sorry, I was just getting a note to make sure everyone could hear me. A small roundworm, or even geese that come in and maybe consume some of the seeds that are just waiting to germinate. Markets are really volatile. And of course, COVID has played a role this year, as it has in many marketplaces, and it's affected farmers as well, even though they work often on their own or in small groups. But their markets have been really affected by COVID. Something else that was mentioned to me once early on, and it hadn't struck me until it was mentioned to me, was that farming is actually a very public activity. Imagine if you were producing something and everyone can just see into the factory floor as you're making your widget, how it's evolving, how it's growing, any problems you might be having. Farming is a really public activity. Your neighbors can see how you're doing. So I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind. I think sometimes farmers feel like they're under the microscope a bit. And I try to keep that in mind as I approach them and ask them to try something new, which we might not know the outcome of, or to take a risk on something in addition to the other risks that are already being taken. Next slide. Also, farmers need to have a broad understanding of plants, of soils. They need to know how to manage machinery and often make in-field fixes. They need to be able to understand economics and markets. Sometimes if they're busy at work planting in May, that morning they might have actually already sold some of their harvest, pre-sold some of their harvest in order to time the market for best return. So there's a lot of small business acumen that's needed. And I have a lot of respect for the multiple variables that come into play in production. as I then knock on a door and say, hey, would you consider trying something like this? Next slide, please. So corn prices, corn is a driver of the market, obviously a very important product. And in the last 8 years, you can see the volatility of that from as high as over $8 per bushel in 2012 to most recently during our COVID era, down close to $3 a bushel. And imagine managing that and how that affects your revenue. And also at the same time, your expenses are going up along with everyone else's in the world. Next slide, please. Soybean prices similarly, huge volatility affected by trade relations and a lot of different factors, as high as $17 a bushel in 2012. And then again, in the early parts of this year, another low point, although it's rebounded slightly. Next slide. So one of the things that OWPP, the Oconomowoc Watershed Protection Program, has done that I think is really innovative, and Tom is to be credited for this, is that from the beginning, he really expressed the intent that we should try to make the farmer whole. And by that, if we're asking a farmer to try something new or implement a conservation project that achieves some other goals, that we provide a funding in order for the farmer to have not have risk, to basically cover the costs of it. And there's two tracks that could be pursued here. On the left side of the screen is if the farmer or landowner works with the city along with the USDA and the National Resource Conservation Service, which typically provides about 70% of the funding. And then the city is coming in and saying, we'll provide additional 30% to make the landowner whole to install that practice on their farm. As a parallel track, a landowner or farmer could get direct funding just from the city if they prefer not to go into contract with the USDA, and get about 90% funding for the installation. And then we have some other partners such as Tall Pines Conservancy, who you'll hear from shortly, or County Land Conservation Departments, the Department of Agriculture for Wisconsin, others that can come in and provide supplemental funding. So in balance, this project is paid for at installation. And then there's one additional layer that's really critical. Next slide, please. So if land is taken out of production, imagine you have this large production with high risks and tight margins. And then Daryl comes knocking on your door saying, would you mind taking this little section of your land out of production for us to plant a buffer to prevent nutrients from entering into a stream? Well, that's land taken out and further reduction in production and revenue. And so the city has come forward through OWPP and said, we're going to provide a rent, a fair rent offset for any land taken out of production. And that's tiered so that if it's highly sensitive land, maybe it's steeper, very close to surface water, lower in the watershed, close to our point of compliance, we're going to pay a higher dollar amount for rent. If it's further away from water, less risky land, so to speak, then we'll have a slightly lower rent offset. But the key is that there is a trade that's happening here, and that's put in place for usually a 10-year period. And then we'll be looking to likely renew those projects if assuming the program continues and that we are successful in making progress towards our goals. Next project, next slide. So here's our challenge. Water moves soil and nutrients across the soil surface. This is a photo taken in our watershed in a June rain event. And June is one of the tough months for us because we can get some pretty big rain events, and also the fields are planted and the crops have not grown to the point that the canopy, the leaves have closed the canopy sufficiently. So all raindrops are hitting the soil surface with full force. And the cumulative effect of that is that even in a field like this that you can see is relatively flat, there's a combined movement of water that can carry topsoil, valuable topsoil and valuable nutrients off the field. Again, it's a public profession, and this isn't to point fingers. It's one of the innate challenges of farming in this climate. Next slide, please. Another way we can do that is by seeding cover crops. And in this case, we're doing this by air, very frequently by helicopter. So the idea with a cover crop is that we're planting a crop that is not being raised for production or sale, but to improve the soil, to cover the soil surface, to add nutrients to the soil, and basically improve the ecosystem as a whole. And there's a cost to this. And that's where OWPP and some other programs can help out to provide that better cover during the periods when the soil is more bare. Next slide, please. You can see here after seeding in mid-September to early October that wheat or rye seeds have started to germinate in the canopy as the crops are starting to dry down. Or in the right photo, that's where corn has been taken off for silage for feeding to livestock. And there's a lot of bare soil exposed to sunlight and to weather. And that's where the cover crop can take root and really produce a nice carpet over time. It'll actually survive the wintertime and then in the springtime fill in even further. Next slide, please. Here's a photo, and you're going to hear more about this from Dennis Stitchen, who's going to talk later, of once that carpet is grown in the following spring. It can be nice and lush at the time of planting. And so after planting occurs, rather than having bare soil that's tilled, there's an actual canopy that will dry down and cover the soil surface. Next slide, please. In June, that canopy then is starting to close by late June, and you can see on the surface the dried residue of the previous cover crop, again, providing really valuable protection. And also that residue then feeds soil microbes, which are part of an entire ecosystem that improves water infiltration and nutrient retention by the soil. Next, please. Our very first project that was installed was back in 2015, and any program like OWPP has to be grateful for the very first one out of the gates. In this case, it's Dick Morris's land, a program that was installed through the Conservation Reserve Program. It's a buffer of 2 ditches that drain fields close to Mason Creek. And we were able to add perennial grasses. So those are grasses that are persisting year after year, provide much better vegetative cover and protect a sensitive area of Mason Creek, which is one of the impaired streams that Tom mentioned. Next, please. A little further up in the watershed, Connie Creek, you can see a really nice grassed buffer strip. That lush green grass is helping to protect soil from moving into the Connie Creek, but also it can absorb nutrients that are soluble before it gets into the waterway. Next, please. We can also put in buffers in the middle of the field. In this case, you can see from the topographic map where the tight lines indicate steeper slopes. So this is a perennial grass buffer, and the farming can continue around that, but the areas where water is picking up speed and really moving with greater force, we're able to slow down and infiltrate through the perennial grass system. Next, please. Another angle is to create a harvestable buffer. So in this case, there's a perennial vegetation that's planted, usually a combination of legumes and grasses that can be cut, harvested by the farmer 2 to 3 times a year, fed to livestock or sold. And at the same time, we are providing still a rent offset. This type of crop is a lower revenue crop, so we're providing again that balance to make the farmer whole and providing an incentive to protect really important areas closer to creeks. Next, please. Perennial grass cover along Mason Creek going into wintertime. This is a photo taken from this fall. You can see that really dense cover and how preferable that is to a tilled land or an annual crop production, particularly in sensitive areas. And then amazingly, Mother Nature can take over. So here's a native prairie plant that's growing in and amongst some invasive reed canary grass. But Joe Pye weed is a great pollinator supporter, and it's happened naturally, but we can also encourage that. So next slide, please. Here we can do that by actually planting native prairies. The one on the right is one of the first ones that went in several years ago on about 20 acres of pollinator habitat. And the one on the left is an additional pollinator buffer right along Mason Creek that has been planted just recently in the last couple of weeks. And yes, we're actually spreading it on top of the snow, and then it melts and further snowfall falls on top of that, presses the seeds into the ground. They lie dormant and then start to emerge in the spring. Although some seeds will actually lie dormant for another year or two through a natural progression that happens when prairies are established. prairie planting can be a little more onerous for the landowner. There's a lot more management that needs to happen in terms of regular mowing in the first couple seasons to limit annual weeds in particular until those natives really take hold. And then the rooting can go down 3, 4, 5 feet deep. And that's really helpful for all the different goals that we have as a watershed. Next, please. This is a prairie buffer that's going in right near North Lake this coming spring. So it's about a less than acre, 0.8 acres, and it's protecting a field of 6 acres. And you can see how close it is to North Lake. It looks like it's not actually bordering the lake, but in fact, there's a drainage path through a culvert that goes under Nelson Drive and goes right into the lake. And so the landowner has been really excited about this project, and we're excited about working with them to put in this narrow prairie buffer, and then the agriculture will continue on the rest of the property. Next, please. We also are working to heal gullies and washouts infield. So this is one from you can see from March. March can be a tough time when there's still a frozen substrate, and then you get some spring rains or a thaw that's happening all at the same time. And so you can get washouts. And you can see over the course of just a few months by planting some grasses that we're able to heal that and provide much more solid vegetative cover. Next, please. And just around the corner from this field, another area where a washout is feeding into a stream. And just in a matter of a few months, much better vegetative cover. The farmer was really, actually came to us to say, would you be interested in putting in a buffer in this area? They could see that the topsoil was washing away. And some of those plants you see in that July photo, they're actually weeds, but what will happen is they get managed through mowing, and the perennial grasses and legumes take over. It becomes a harvestable buffer if the farmer wants to do that. Next, please. We're also working with producers to repair ditches. So when there have been, basically a ditch is a valuable way to get water away from wet fields, and periodically need to be cleaned out in order to function properly. So what we try to do is work with the landowner to repair those, just the slopes adjacent to the ditches with perennial grasses, and get them revegetated as quickly as possible. Next, please. In terms of our impacts, as of January of this year, we have 44 long-term projects. And by that we mean 5- and 10-year projects. And that you can see the numbers of projects in blue and the different types of projects that we've implemented. And I've mentioned particularly filter and buffer strips. There's also other things that can be put in, sedimentation basins where flowing water can be allowed to slow down and sediment to settle out. Restoring wetlands, working with grass swales, even encouraging more grazing as a way to establish perennial cover year after year. You can see the amount of acres that have been implemented in orange, and that includes the acreage that's just directly related to the project. So if you put in a 0.8 acre buffer near North Lake, that's what that's what combines to the orange numbers that you see. But that also tells us that we're protecting many, many more acres beyond those 530. And so we can use that protection and understand that and extrapolate to how much protection we're providing across the watershed. In the next slide, we'll see what that looks like from a number standpoint. So our long-term projects, 530 acres. Seasonal cover, that would be like cover crops that we're doing by helicopter, generally around 2,000 acres per year. So a little over 2,500 acres per year. And if we estimate about 1 pound of phosphorus per acre per year controlled or prevented from entering into the water, that's about 2,500 pounds of phosphorus controlled per year. And Tom has mentioned a rule of thumb, about 500 pounds of algae can grow per pound of phosphorus in the water. So that's well over 1 million pounds of algae that have been prevented from growing as a result in a modeled or an estimated fashion from the work that we've done to date. Ultimately, our success is going to be measured by the point of compliance, what happens in terms of the actual nutrient numbers in the water where the Oconomowoc River meets the Rock River. But this is at least a really good start, and we are using these benchmarks and needing to report these benchmarks to the DNR so they understand the kind of progress that we're making on an annual basis. So that's a basic summary of the agricultural projects. And I'd like to move into our next section.
Hey, Daryl, before you jump into the next section, we did have a couple of questions on
Great.
some of the slides that you had. Tom answered one in the chat. Thank you, Tom. Another one is, are you using some form of nutrient modeling to quantify the anticipated reductions from each improvement, or do you only rely on in-stream monitoring to determine improvements?
Yeah, so there are a couple different models out there that can be done. Farms that have livestock in particular use nutrient management plans that are filed with the state to look at how nutrients are applied to soils in the farm. And so that's a SNAP Plus, that program can be used to calculate the phosphorus controlled and sequestered in various practices. This 1 pound that we're doing is more of a rule of thumb, but there's also an additional model that we can implement, and the acronym is escaping me right now. And we can do that periodically through the help of an engineering firm, Rupert Milke, that partners with us. But we're not doing that continuously. There's a lot of factors that goes into that calculation. What we're more or less doing is realizing that this is an estimation of what the impact we're having, and then we're watching the water values as the ultimate bottom line. Anything else on the questions before we move forward?
There are a couple that I'll save for a little bit later.
Okay.
Daryl, one thing that I'll add is that the 530 acres is actual best management practice acres and does not represent the controlled acres.
Correct.
Actually, a very conservative value as well. So there's a lot of conservativity, if I can use that word, built into this estimate. It's easier to defend ourselves if we're being conservative. So hopefully we're actually seeing much more removal than the 2,500 pounds, but that's what we'd like to report at this point.
And this doesn't represent all the work that's going on in the watershed. There's actually in-stream work that's happening that we'll touch on, as well as work going on at the plant. So we're going to be able to get larger values aggregating all these types of practices together to get the goals that we want.
Here's a follow-up question. Is SNAP Plus being used for modeling the total phosphorus leaving the fields?
It can be, but we're not actively using that because on a continuous basis. So at a certain point, we will probably implement some of those types of models and really study specific projects. But there's a lot that goes into that. So we don't have the capacity of that for every project yet.
Okay, and then how are you reporting pounds reduction?
So the pounds is a total pounds of phosphorus we're actually reporting it as pounds to the DNR, but when we look at the monitoring data, and maybe Tom can explain more about this, he's much more involved in that end of the project. It's looking at a concentration of phosphorus as opposed to pounds, and it's the concentration that we're going to actually need to meet. Tom, do you want to add anything more to that? I see him
Sure.
replying on chat, but okay.
Sure, there's I didn't know if I wanted to get into the weeds this far today, but there's two things going on. There's concentration of phosphorus throughout the watershed, and there's mass loading. Mass loading is the quantity of phosphorus moving through the watershed, and that's really what affects water quality in the end. Concentration is certainly an issue on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, but it's the mass loading that's moving through the watershed and actually feeding the algae growth, feeding the plant growth, causing eutrophication in our lakes and that type of thing. So the adaptive management program, though, is built on meeting a concentration at the compliance point, and that concentration basically translates then to the mass loading that is being delivered to the Rock River. So by looking at concentration and knowing what the volumes are at that point of confluence, it basically satisfies the requirements and the limits by just using concentration. Hopefully that answers that question.
And then
Great.
one last question that is specific to this section, Daryl, is regarding the contracts with the farmers. The question is, when you enter an agreement with the farmer, how long is that active for, i.e. 1 year, 5 years?
Yeah, generally it's 5 years or 10 years. The vast majority we've written in 10-year contracts. And the idea is that ideally they will be renewed, but we have to cross that bridge when we get to it from a funding standpoint, as well as the landowner or farmer being interested and willing to continue it. So, but at least we're contracted for 5 to 10 years generally. The 1-year programs is what falls into the seasonal category that we had up in terms of those numbers. So yes, let's appreciate all those questions and happy to answer more during the Q&A at the end. I do want to introduce Farmers for Lake Country and specifically Dennis Stitchin and say a quick background on Farmers for Lake Country and what it is. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We might be stuck.
Daryl, I just got a message from Beth that she's lost her audio.
Okay,
So I don't know, Chris, if you can jump in on that.
you can see my salute.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know, Chris, if perhaps you can communicate with her to
I'm going
work
to
on
try to
another-
solve this right now.
maybe
yeah.
solve it. Forgive us for our technical, this isn't what we do in our day jobs typically. So, but Farmers for Lake Country is an organization that's supported from multiple parties, but it's a program within the Oconomowoc Watershed Protection Program, and it focuses, it's a producer-led program. So it's farmers working peer-to-peer, talking about soil health, comparing notes. It's supported financially from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection. We've been really fortunate to get several grants from DATCAP most years that we've been in operation, and we have one again for 2021, so very appreciative of that. The city has provided significant funding, and then also partners like Tall Pines have come in with and help with funding, help with hosting events. Beth, who's working in the background of this slideshow, is really instrumental in getting the word out and publicity about the work that we're doing and organizing events. So, and you'll see a note there, Professional Dairy Producers of Wisconsin is one of the donors that's been helpful with certain initiatives. So, but bottom line, it's a peer-to-peer producer-led group. And I'm really happy that Dennis Stitchin is here today to share more about what work he's been doing as a farmer in our watershed and for his participation in Farmers for Lake Country. So I'd like to turn it over to him and have him explain a little more about work that he's been doing. So if we can do next slide, if someone's able to advance that.
Is the next slide signal going? Okay.
Yeah,
Here
the
we go.
next slide, hopefully Beth can get her audio back. And Dennis, you're probably looking for the next slide as well. That's the last slide of my
I'd
little
like the next
introduction.
slide. There, the map.
There we go.
That's where I'm going. Yeah, I'm Dennis Stitchin. This map shows some of the land of my farm. This is in the Oconomowoc River watershed. Threes Lake is up there at the top. Low Lake is left and center. I'll give a little history and the progression of my farming operation. I started farming in the mid-1970s with a dairy farm. The farm is located right in the middle of this map where all the homes and the developments are now. When I started, my field preparations were chisel plowing and field cultivating the soil, which at that time were considered conservation practices. My soils are relatively shallow with a gravel base, so I often wondered why I was tilling deep when all my organic matter and nutrients were shallow. Over the years, I steadily decreased tilling So now all I do is an occasional pass with a coulter machine to cut and size corn stalks. My first attempt at no-till was about 1983 when I planted corn into a freshly harvested hayfield. The results were okay. I got corn silage, but did not have the equipment at that time or the technology that we have today. Can we do the next slide now? There we go, good. I guess we got audio. Eventually, I got results like this. Planting soybeans into corn stalk residue. Leaving the residue on the surface is beneficial in many ways. It will prevent soil movement from wind and rain, and also sequesters carbon from the air. Another benefit of no-till is the undisturbed soil gives the soil microbial colonies the ability to thrive without being disturbed by tillage. On the dairy farm in 1982, I also put a manure storage system in so I could time the application of animal waste and gain benefits from the manure applied to my cropland. Next slide. After a few years, I was applying manure by pumping and injecting directly into the soil. This saved fuel, fertilizer costs, and prevented runoff into the river. My farmstead was 1 mile from Oconomowoc River, but I felt it was still the right thing to do. Also in the 80s, I started using fertilizer placement and humic acids to help stabilize the applied nutrients to the soil. Humics are coal-based products that help adhere added fertilizer to the soil particles. It keeps applied fertilizer from moving in the soil. Next slide. In 1998, a weather event destroyed my dairy buildings, so I decided to focus on crops. Because my crop rotation was mainly corn and soybeans at this time, I could see the soil activity was diminishing after harvest. I kept decreasing tillage and started to introduce cover crops. I noticed that with less tillage, the earthworms were more abundant, and I understood that the microbial colonies must be increasing. The soil was becoming more alive. In 1999 and 2000, I had an airplane plant winter wheat into my soybean crop. The wheat would start growing before the beans got harvested. That would give a longer season for soil activity. I liked that idea, but pilots were very nervous about flying fixed-wing airplanes over the developing area. So when farmers for Lake Country asked if I would be interested in cover crops applied by helicopter, I was all on board. Next slide. In the last 3 years, I flew on over 1,580 acres of cover crops on some of the acres that I farm. The rye seed we plant with the helicopter will start growing in the fall, during and after harvest, and continue to grow on warm days until it is time to plant corn or soybeans next spring. You can see that last year I planted less with the helicopter, but I'm starting a new practice on some acres this year. I'm going to try frost seeding by applying the seed to frozen ground in February or March. Certain seeds can germinate in cool temperatures, and as the soil warms, they will continue to grow. It will still have some time to grow before planting begins. This is done on corn stalks because we find it is hard to cut for cover crops to get started with so much corn residue in the fall. Next slide. This is a view from the planter. I'm planting corn into a green field. The rye in this field was about 12 inches tall. I think the date was May 5th. Yeah, the date was May 5th. I sprayed a liquid nitrogen fertilizer and an additive to terminate the growth of the cover crop and feed the corn, the new corn crops with the fertilizer too. As the rye plants die, they help feed the newly planted corn seeds. The old rye crop covers the soil to help with weed control and moisture escape. Because of the plant competition, the diseases and insects, scouting the fields to watch for problems is a little more necessary. But this practice has worked pretty good for me. Next slide. This is another slide of planting. You can see it it's not a real thick stand, but it's ideal for planting a crop into. The root structure of the rye is throughout the top few inches and not only holds the soil from erosion, it also carries the tractor very well in wetter conditions. I have been planting sooner after a rainfall without mud sticking to the tires or causing compaction problems. The roots keep the soil aerated and healthy. Next slide. This is the same field, July 11th. The corn has grown well and has a good green color. The only time I drove on that field was to apply fertilizer in April, spray nitrogen and weed control in May. I planted on May 5th, and then one more pass of nitrogen with a Y-drop applicator. The only soil disturbance is with the planter to put the seed in the ground. My fuel costs, equipment costs, and labor costs are greatly reduced. I farm mostly by myself with very little outside help. Next slide. Every year, farming is an experiment. We have different weather, different insects, and different diseases to work with for the crops. But I believe that planting a cover crop, or at least tilling your fields less, can help save the soil that is on your farm. And I have discovered that planting green can help soils be healthier and result in better water infiltration that will keep nutrients and soil in the field and not in the lakes and streams. Daryl, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I just want to point out from this slide, and Dennis, you've been part of this real incredible work of Farmers for Lake Country. You can see when the groups got organized and what happened in terms of the cover crops applied that we were aware of and participated in the Oconomowoc watershed, just a dramatic increase. So I'm really grateful for the work the entire group has done. Dennis has taken that to sort of the next level by planting green and leaving that residue to grow as long as possible, which takes a little bit of trust that you're not going to outcompete what you're trying to grow as a cash crop. But it's really very impressive. And if you recall that slide earlier that showed the runoff in June, it's Dennis's work as a great example of what we can do to help prevent that. So very much appreciate, Dennis, your contributions, and hopefully you can stick around for some Q&A as well. I will add that in Farmers for Lake Country meetings, because I'm not a farmer, I typically get in the way of the kind of great chit chat and comparing of notes. I just kind of stand back because it gets very technical quickly. And it's really impressive to see the work that's being done. So thank you, Dennis. And thanks for being part of our presentation.
You're welcome.
Today.
And I enjoyed the ride along on the corn planter. It was fun.
Yeah, that was fun. I got some good videos. That'll be one of the videos we show in the break time before Q&A. So next slide, please. So we're going to pass it back to Tom, and thanks everyone for sticking with us, even though this is a longer presentation, but hopefully we can keep it lively enough. And but all the work is not just happening on the agricultural landscape. The city is involved in real direct projects around stormwater that Tom's going to give us a tour of.
Okay, thanks, Daryl and Dennis. As you can see, we've got a lot going on in the ag community and some really good partners that are working with us. On the city side, from a stormwater standpoint, I wanted to highlight a few of the projects that they've been doing. We don't get as much reduction in phosphorus from stormwater projects, but they're still very valuable projects. So I'm going to highlight 4 projects today for you. Next slide. So first one is the parking lot behind City Hall on Fowler Lake. And this project was done between 2017 and 2019. Next slide. This is a little blurry, sorry about that, but back here behind City Hall is the parking lot area that was reconstructed. And this is a very challenging project because it's very flat and the water level is very high relative to the surface here. So there isn't much room to do a whole lot below the surface. But the city engaged a consultant to look at all of our possibilities here. Next slide. And basically came up with a plan to install bioretention areas and 2 large catch basins. So the retention areas are shown kind of scattered around the parking lot in those shaded areas. And then the 2 large catch basins are shown on the left side to take water in from that area. And inside of these catch basins, we installed something called snouts, which actually capture solid debris that's coming in from the parking lot as well. So this was a kind of a complicated design. Like I say, a lot of challenges due to the topography. And the next slide will show you some examples of these bioretention areas where the flow is directed towards. Next slide. Another bioretention area. Next one. Also included a feature along the lake itself with these bump outs, which were eventually dressed up with some above the ground features. And this turned out to be a really pretty project for the city, really very popular in the summer. And took care of some runoff situations from the parking lot that are now captured in the bioretention areas or in the large catch basins. Next slide. There was lighting added to this, and this is kind of a cool shot of the project completed. But you can see here how close the water surface is to the actual ground surface, which made this project so challenging. Okay, next slide. So the next project is a development on the southwest side of the city, which has drainage from the street gutter area down into basically a farm field. But as you can see, the Oconomowoc River is very close by here. So we've been working with one of our farmers in our group, Matt Tokarski, to actually plant this ground and start rehabbing it because it was left fallow and a lot of noxious weeds were growing in here. So we've been farming this to basically bring the soil health back to a good condition so it can absorb these stormwater drainage discharges from this development. So the area north of the development in the red area is the area we've been working in. And this will eventually become a natural nature park. Next slide. Again, the area that's being farmed. Next slide. And last year, one of the interns for the city actually took the time to look at what type of trail system we could have here in this natural park. So the preliminary plan for this area is to incorporate natural trails, possibly with some boardwalks, and actually continue farming it indefinitely into the future to make sure that it stays in a good health status and does not fall back into the state that it was a few years ago. Next slide. Okay, so the area along Rosenau Creek, which is on the east side of the city, was being impacted by development, and the city wanted to make sure that there wasn't negative effects from that because this is a Class 1 trout stream. There's actually 2 Class 1 trout streams in the watershed. So we entered into a project with a number of different funding partners. DATCAP, Fish and Wildlife, Waukesha County, the city, all combined efforts. And this project started in 2019 with the construction of 3 scrapes, which basically are holding areas for drainage water to allow them to seep into the ground rather than run off into the neighboring creek. So there's 3 scrapes in this location, and then there's basically perennial prairie planted around them. Next slide. Just pointing to the scrapes here and where the creek is. The creek is running from bottom right to upper left here. And this is the south branch of Rosenau Creek. Next slide. And here you can see the development that was occurring while this project was going on. And single family on the left, multifamily on the right. So without stormwater control here, you can see that there would be a substantial amount of surface runoff. And I want to point out that the treed area that is to the west, thank you, Beth, with your cursor, that is a steep slope. So these single family development areas on the top of the hill here all would be discharging down this steep slope into this area and flowing into the creek without these scrapes. Next slide. Just a few pictures of the construction of the scrapes. Another one. Next slide. Okay, next slide. All right, and the last one that I want to talk about is the Worthington Street Stormwater Pond. This is a 1.2 acre pond, I believe, approximately, located right in the central area of the city. And it's designed to remove 53 pounds of phosphorus per year. So as you can see, that's not a big amount, but from a stormwater standpoint, the big hitter is the suspended solids. And look at that, 21,000 pounds per year of TSS will be captured in this pond. In addition to that, though, we'll see volume reduction and dampening, which will help our downstream partners downstream of the city that oftentimes tell us that the development in the city is causing them issues along the riverbank. So this area that the pond actually treats from is about 147 acres. So a large area of surface water is entering this pond now and being captured here and allowed to settle, in contrast to what was happening prior to this. And basically that was a straight pipe out to the Oconomowoc River. Next slide. So this is what the pond looks like. It has a 4-bay. That's the small rectangular area in the bottom right, and then has the main bay of the pond. This is a typical sedimentation type, retention type basin with the 4-bay to capture the initial load of suspended solids. Next slide. Just a few pictures of construction here. Next one. Geese, of course, love the project. And as you can see, the finished berm there under the matting and the finished pond. Next slide. And then, of course, the city requires all developments to install stormwater ponds and retention basins to make sure that the developments result in a net zero discharge compared to what was there prior to the development. So hats off to the city's DPW department for continuing to take a hard line on this and cause developments to be mindful of the environment and not cause negative effects as a result of that development. All right, so the next section will be our river and stream projects, and I'm going to turn it back to Daryl and Susan Buchanan.
Yes, so I'll just introduce Susan. Susan is the executive director of Tall Pines Conservancy, which is really a significant partner with the Watershed program. I can't really count all the ways, but from a staff support and even specific projects that we're working on, which you'll hear about now, I'm very excited to have Susan present a little bit about Tall Pines and some of Tall Pines' work in the watershed.
Thanks, Daryl. Can everybody hear me? Yay. Tall Pines is a land trust. We're a nonprofit land trust operating in the watershed. Our mission is to preserve our rural heritage by protecting remaining farmland, water resources, natural areas, and open spaces impacting and adjacent to northwestern Waukesha County. But specifically, we are working in the Ashuappan River watershed as well as the Oconomowoc River watershed. I want to do a little bit of an icebreaker for fun. So if you look down on the bar at the bottom of your screen, hopefully everybody can see, there's a little icon that says reactions. And I want you to raise your hand if you know of Tall Pines or if you've heard of us. And I hope it ends up being everybody. Woo! Yay! Yay! All right. That's fabulous. Okay, great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we became a major partner with the Oconomowoc Watershed Protection Program itself. I think Tom and I met at a Mason Creek Partners meeting way back in 2013, which is frankly hard to believe for both of us. But at that time, Tall Pines was looking at taking a watershed approach to our conservation planning. In other words, the Land Trust Alliance, which is a national group of land trusts, that was really promoting that land trusts look at watersheds as their focus when prioritizing land protection projects. And at the same time, the city of Oconomowoc was looking at how to meet their permitting standards, whether they were going to go brick and mortar, as Tom described earlier, or if they were going to take a larger watershed approach. So their decision obviously was the watershed approach. And so we came together in a partnership and applied for a number of grants and programming, the main one being the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which we call RCPP, which has been very instrumental in moving this project ahead. So we are also key collaborators with the Farmers for Lake Country, which Daryl and Dennis did a great job of describing. And we also are a key partner with Lake Country Clean Waters, which was formerly called the Clean Water Association. If you are not familiar with Lake Country Clean Waters, it's an association of the lakes in the Lake Country area. In other words, the lake districts, the lake associations, the Friends group, that's working to protect the lakes, rivers, and streams. And they're doing that by connecting these groups together, sharing information, sharing education on things that the lakes are the most interested in, like invasive species and other things specific to the lakes. So our primary tool at Tall Pines for protecting land is with conservation easements. And I would like to invite Chris Scuchenritter, who is our land protection manager, to talk a little bit more about the specifics of conservation easements. So go ahead, Chris.
Sure, thanks, Susan. 10,000 foot view, 1 minute on what a conservation easement is and can't do. It is the primary tool of our organization and many organizations like ours to protect land from various pressures that would compromise what we call conservation values of the property. So it's a voluntary legal agreement between the landowner and an organization like ours, whose mission is to preserve the land and the conservation values of the land. It is tailored to meet the resource conservation needs of that particular parcel, and similarly tailored to meet the objectives of the landowners in terms of their family legacy, the land's history, and the land's the resources that are pertinent to that particular piece of land. The beautiful thing about it is it really is a legacy tool, because once we reach that agreement and we place a conservation easement over the land, it runs in perpetuity. So when you sell the land, it will still be protected for indefinite transactions after that. Another very beautiful part about this tool is that you retain full ownership of the land. So you can continue to use the land, farm the land, forest on the land, assuming that we've tailored the agreement to accommodate those uses. So it really is, it's taking a snapshot of the land right now, looking at the conservation resources on the land, including agricultural use, and then protecting those and enhancing those in perpetuity into the future. If you go, just a quick plug for Tall Pines, if you go to tallpinesconservancy.org, there is we'll put a link in the chat, there is a page that briefly talks about conservation easements, and specifically about protecting farmland and how that can benefit your family and the community and the resource values on your property.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Sure.
Okay, next slide, please. So for example, we just completed the purchase of development rights and a conservation easement on the Meyer family farm, which is pretty much at the top end of the watershed near Slinger. It's 151 acres under easement. The Cooney River runs through it, or creek runs through it. And we're working with the Meyer family on some installation of best practices, such as buffers along the creek as well. And we also are in the process, and pretty darn close to closing, I hope, on another easement in the watershed along Cooney Creek, which is with the Lofi family and also the Richfield Historical Society. So we're looking forward to telling you more about that when that's closed. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about Mason Creek. So I think it was 2011, and Jerry Hine is on this call too. So if I'm wrong with some of this history, Jerry, please let me know. But in 2011, the North Lake Management District did a study with a consultant. They wanted to find out which of the 3 feeder streams that feed into North Lake, which are the Mason Creek, Little Oconomowoc River, and the Oconomowoc River, was creating, a lot of sediment and nutrient loading in the lake. And to everybody's surprise, it was Little Mason Creek. And Mason Creek is, as Tom mentioned earlier, is one of the 3 in the watershed that is a DNR designated impaired stream, but it's also a class 1 trout stream, which is interesting. So we at the Land Trust basically designated Mason Creek as a priority area within our work in the watershed. And from there, the North Lake Management District received a grant from the DNR, I believe, to hire Sewer PAC, the Regional Plan Commission, to do a river management plan. And that plan was completed in 2018. And it included a number of recommendations and strategies to help with, as I mentioned, the sediment loading and the nutrient loading in the creek that eventually feeds into North Lake. So we began working very diligently on those strategies. And next, let's see, next slide, please. So our first project was talked about earlier by Daryl, which was working on 2 ditches on some farmland north and along the creek that were where buffers were installed. But most recently, we purchased 26 acres of the Schmidt land, which is along Pleasant View Road and also borders the creek. And we did that specifically to, maybe next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back. Okay, we did that specifically to remeander the creek. So if you look on the far right on this slide, you can see there is a straight line, which is the creek itself. And yeah, thank you, Beth. And that obviously had been ditched and straightened, I don't know, 40 years ago. The blue line is a proposed remeander. So we recently got a grant. We worked on an engineering study and design for this, and we are going into construction. We're applying for a number of grants to help us with the actual construction of the remeander, hopefully this year. Okay, next slide, thanks. So other strategies that we are using, we will be implementing a pollinator buffer along the stream on the Schmidt land as well. And that, hopefully will help with erosion control, improving water infiltration and nutrient absorption from the surrounding fields, as well as supporting wildlife. So that, I think that was seeded actually already, and hopefully takes about 3 years for that to come up, but we're looking forward to that as well. And how about the next slide, please? Another strategy that was outlined in the study as well is culvert removal. And we were able to do that thanks to some generous help by Mark Tyson, a volunteer in the area. He helped us with his equipment to remove this, as you can see, this enormous culvert. There's been some other culvert removals as well. And we are also working on invasive species control and removal in the creek area. Along Peterson Road specifically, we're working on a Phragmites removal project that has been generously funded by CWISC, which stands for Southeast Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium. And we also have done some buckthorn removal as well, which helps with erosion also. And next slide, please. So other activities that we've done in the watershed, we own a very small property, but it's a very unique one. It's 0.39 acres and it's next to the yacht club on North Lake. It's an ephemeral pond, but you can see here, we had some volunteers planting plants along the shoreline for shoreline restoration. Next slide, please. And that's what it ended up looking like, which I think is just gorgeous and, serves as a great buffer there as well. And I also, before I end here, I would like to thank Jill Bedford for her for commandeering and for her commitment to Mason Creek. Jill has just been fabulous as far as pulling all the neighbors together and other partners for, well, it's probably been close to 10 years now for our work on Mason Creek. So thank you, Jill. And with that, I will turn it over to Daryl.
Great, thank you, Susan, for that summary. I saw a question pop up in chat about how specifically does remeandering reduce phosphorus loading in the Mason Creek sub-watershed. And so I want to address that right now. It is accomplished through a couple different methods. As you can see, there's the straight line current channel of Mason Creek. And by remeandering, we're adding twists and bends that have multiple natural features. So you can have areas that are shallow and rocky with riffles of faster moving water, and then deeper areas where fish and other aquatic life will more likely congregate in pools. And then we are adding ways to protect the faster moving areas where water maybe would have a tendency to scour the banks by protecting it with towwood, which is lengths of more significant lengths of brush and wood that's embedded in the embankment to stabilize soil. And then over time, the natural vegetation will grow into that. And so what that does is it creates a channel that is less likely to erode and has natural features for the water to slow down and allow sediments to settle out. And then there's another major benefit, which is that as you add this new secondary path, the previous channel where all the legacy sediment has moved in and settled. And if you imagine with every successive large rain event, the sediment just gets pushed further and further downstream gradually. Well, by taking that whole channel offline and putting in a new channel that's better designed with natural features, you basically sequester and hold all that legacy sediment on site. And then natural vegetation will grow in and stabilize it. So it's those two main features, both a healthier channel section and by stabilizing the previous legacy sediment, you're able to prevent that, that sediment and nutrient from washing downstream. There's also a third feature, which we'll see in the next slide, which is that not only is it a matter of changing the design of it, but we're actually changing the topography. So the old channelized stream would have been more flat until you get to the channel, and it has very vertical walls and it's deeper. And then you can imagine it's hard for vegetation to grow on those steep sloped walls, and then it erodes. Instead, what we do is we have a topography that basically integrates the creek into the surrounding floodplain, so that as a large rain event happens and the stream rises, the water level rises, it simultaneously spreads out and slows down. And so any sediment going into the stream has a better likelihood of filtering out, of settling down. And then also the vegetation will grow better on those more gradually sloped banks. And essentially the stream will function as a natural stream bed would be more likely to, and over time serve as a filter rather than as a problem causing feature. Next slide. So our goal and what's been estimated from the engineering work is that we could prevent 100 pounds of total phosphorus annually from moving downstream each year. And this would potentially save, using our rule of thumb, about 50,000 pounds of algae growth in North Lake in 1 year. It's not an insignificant project. We're in the process of applying for state grants, and we'll also need some individual contributions. So we'll be putting the call out, and we welcome contributions for those who see this as a beneficial project, because one of the great things about it is it doesn't expire. It's not a 5 or 10 year contract. It's something that will continue over the lifespan of the project, 20 or 50 years. And we're building into our cost of the project ongoing maintenance just to preserve the benefits that have been created by the construction. Next slide. There are some other creeks and streams within the watershed I do want to mention just as a postscript to that Mason Creek project. So there's a stream course running through the club at Lac La Belle. This is on the north side of Lac La Belle, and it has a very, very steeply meandering portions and had some scoured banks, and we're working collectively with the village of Lac La Belle, the golf course itself, Lac La Belle Lake District, as well as the city to combine to apply for grants and provide funding to restore this section of the creek. And you can see in the next slide where that has already started to happen. So the village of Lac La Belle invested in a section of creek that they particularly own. On the left side is the before photo, and you can see how the water basically scours it as it runs around these bends, and a section is sloughed off. You can see that sloughed off section in the middle photo, and you can see therefore how a protected side of that creek is now armored with stone, and vegetation will eventually begin moving through that and growing in through that. So this is just brand new, recently completed. These are photos from this fall. It will begin to look more natural over time, but there are strategies like that that we want to implement on the other side, the east side of the creek actually, as well as further down. In the next slide, you'll see there's a diagram of the different reaches that we're going to be addressing, and the ones in red, reach 2, 3, and 4, you can see pictured where there's again washout as it goes through the course itself, the golf course, and we'll be wanting to protect it, maybe less with stone and riprap, but again, more with toewood and other ways to integrate the stream into the landscape and allow vegetation to grow in more naturally. And that's planned for starting in this year, 2021. Next slide. There's an additional creek that runs across Allen Road. This is south and west of town, where we notice the same process in play of scoured banks, very vertical banks, and also because of the buckthorn cover, what we call sort of a moonscape, particularly in the early season, of almost no vegetation covering the banks of this really rich organic soil. So you can imagine a drop of water hitting that bank and then carrying microparticles of organic matter right into the creek and down into the lower stem of the Oconomowoc River. So stay tuned. This is one that we will be measuring the water quality and try to estimate how much investment is needed in order to improve this waterway. Next slide, please. This is actually the creek that goes through the golf course, but a little further north in the agricultural area, slightly less extreme, but similar process of buckthorn shading out the vegetation over time. Various trees will die and fall in, and that gradual eroding of the stream bank is something we're going to try to remediate in the next year or two. Next slide. And I'm going to pass it over to Tom now to talk about monitoring. These is ultimately where we measure the success of what we're doing. And Tom has been a very key player involved in monitoring and can fill us in on where we are with that.
Okay, thanks, Daryl. We are running substantially behind, so I would rather not fly through this section. So I'm going to ask for a reaction from the group if you would like to have us speed through these last few sections, or if we should take the time to go through them. So just hand raise if you'd like to see us go through these in a normal amount of time, please. Okay, so I think I'm getting the feeling that you're willing to spend the extra time. So I'm gonna go through these in what we had planned and hopefully not keep you too long as a result of that. So let me get things back organized. Okay, can you all hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, all right. So big part of this program obviously is monitoring. We have to know where we've come to know where we're going. And the city of Oconomowoc has been monitoring the Oconomowoc River in the city limits for literally decades. So we had a lot of data on what was going on in our immediate location. But we started expanding that monitoring to look at more of the upstream areas even before adaptive management was put into place. So what I want to do is give you a feel for what the phosphorus levels look like in the watershed as we do our monitoring, and give you a sense of where we're at and what our challenges are. So next slide. So first of all, just to remind everyone that our main point of compliance within the adaptive management program is to reduce that phosphorus level at the end of the Oconomowoc River where it dumps into the Rock River. So everything we do upstream of this point will eventually reduce this level and give us the results we need, in addition to improving water quality up and down the watershed. Now, going from 0.09 milligrams per liter to 0.075 doesn't seem like a lot, but there's 90 million gallons of water flowing from the Oconomowoc River on an average day into the Rock River. So if you multiply that out towards the concentration, there's a lot of pounds of phosphorus that are being delivered to the Rock River that have to be addressed. So next slide. Okay, so our monitoring programs are what we call our baseline program, which is required in the adaptive management program, and that's a once a month sampling of roughly 30 points in the watershed. We also have a mud chaser program, which is a network of volunteers. And then we also have a Mason Creek specific program, because that's the worst impaired stream we have into the main Oconomowoc. Next slide. So our baseline monitoring sites are shown here with the black triangles, and the official data that is required in the adaptive management program is May through October. So those 6 months are the critical months. The months outside of that time period, we still do sampling. However, those will not be figured into the final compliance equation in the latter years of the program. So we get out and do event monitoring as well, in addition to the once per month monitoring in May through October. And again, confluence site number 18 is shown here where it enters the Rock River. Next slide. So here's what typically happens in the watershed. And on your right, the headwaters are represented, and on your left is where the Oconomowoc River flows into the Rock River. So this is a little backwards, but it's drawn this way because that's the way it appears on a map. It generally flows from right to left. So the headwaters is an area that has a fair amount of agricultural activity. There's some pretty good topography up around Holy Hill that contributes to the issues. So generally speaking, we see high levels of phosphorus in the upper reaches of the watershed in the headwaters. As the water flows down through the lakes chain, however, the numbers drop. And this is a perfect example of the filtering capacities of that chain of lakes. As I mentioned before, there's 17 different lakes in the watershed. However, there's lakes that are off to the side that contribute into the trunk system of the river, but there's also the main 6 or 7 lakes that are actually flow-through lakes. So those are the lakes that are actually acting as the filters, and you can see the result of that here. The numbers are well below the 0.075 criteria at that point. But as the water moves from that lakes chain through the city of Oconomowoc, entering an area outside the city where the treatment plant contributes phosphorus, and also into another agricultural area, you can see the numbers start to climb again. So this is a very typical activity that we see in our sampling for the baseline monitoring. Next slide. So to give you an example of a monthly monitoring, here's a wet month of July in this year, this last year. You can see the numbers are extremely high in the headwaters, and they come down through the lakes chain, and then they increase again after that. Next slide. And here's an example of a dry month of May. All the numbers were below the 0.075 criteria. Next slide. And here's a real puzzling one, August of 2020. Generally, the flow had dropped to very minimal flows by the time we hit the beginning of August this year. Rainfalls had dropped off. The water temperatures and air temperatures had climbed, and we had very good results through the entire watershed, except for point 18, which does not make any sense, frankly. So in this case, we're suspecting highly that the influence of the Rock River is actually influencing our Northside Drive sampling point at point 18. Because you can see on this graph, there's a number 19 and a number 17 on the extreme left. Those are numbers taken from the Rock River before and after the confluence. So the Rock River is running very high, 0.33 or 0.31, 0.32 at this point. And it is our feeling that it is influencing our last sampling point, which is site 18, and actually causing that value to be higher than it would be if it wasn't that close to the confluence. So we'll be looking at that down the road and seeing if that's really a good evaluation of what the Oconomowoc River's concentrations are. Next slide. So here's 2020 and the phosphorus values each month represented with the orange circles. And the values are next to those orange circles. And then the bars that are on this graph represent the precipitation. So starting in May, you can see there was a fairly good rainfall earlier in May. Then June calmed down. Numbers were below 0.75. And then we had a pretty good rainfall in early July, above 2.5 inches. So that brought the value upward to that 0.121. But then, as I said, things started to dry out, and then we had that 0.258 value at the confluence, which we're having a hard time believing that's actually the Oconomowoc River. That's probably the combination of the Rock River and the Oconomowoc. And then there's two values after that, September and October, and you can see the October value was extremely low, down at 0.036. So an interesting year for sure. Next slide. Okay, so we're all about the 5-year progress here in this presentation. So here's the last 6 years represented in our effluent value at the confluence and also the precipitation. And one could say that we couldn't have picked a worse time to start the adaptive management program. Because if you look at the rainfall totals each year, starting in 2015, we were above average already. The light blue line represents the average annual precip. So in 2015, we were a couple inches above. 2016, another big year in 17. And then in 2018, we actually set a record for the total rainfall for the Oconomowoc National Oceanics and Aviation, or whatever it means, NOAA site. We actually set a record for the total rainfall in 2018. Oddly enough, though, our phosphorus values came down, and we have a saying in the wastewater industry that says something like this: the solution to pollution is dilution. So when you have so much water running through a system, you can actually dilute the concentrations, and that's the result in 2018. However, as I mentioned before, the mass loading during this time was tremendous because we had a lot of water moving through the system. And if you multiply that with the concentration, you end up with a huge amount of phosphorus moving through the system. So then in 2019, our rainfall dropped to still above our average rainfall amount by a good 6 inches. And then we finally had a dry year here in 2020 where we were well below our average. So I've put a dotted line on this graph to represent where we think we probably are if we take out that high value in August of 2020. Just to take a look at where we'd be at, and we're at about 0.090 at the 2020 average point. So if you're wondering where we've come in the last 6 years in terms of concentration of phosphorus, this is the graph to look at. And you can see we've got a ways to go. So the topography, the activities, the land uses in the watershed obviously have been there a long time. The characteristics of our lakes, put that all together, and it's going to take time to change all that. Things don't happen overnight. So this gives you though where we've been in the last 6 years. Next slide. Okay, moving on then to our Mud Chaser program real quickly. This is a group of volunteers that have come out and asked to be part of this group. And basically this group is armed with safety vests, Secchi tubes, sample bottles, rain gauges, log sheets, and sampling tubes to go out during events such as rainfall events or directly after those events at critical locations, make observations and sample when it's appropriate. So this has been a great group for us. Next slide, please. We've broken up the watershed into 8 zones. So each group is assigned to a zone. Next slide. And through this program, or this sub-program, I guess you'd call it, is hotspots that we've identified and we've been working towards. And we actually figure into our payment structure for projects, whether or not these projects are within these hotspot zones. So this has been a great program for us to identify where our real problems are. Next slide. And then the Mason Creek sampling area. Susan and Daryl mentioned this before, but the Mason Creek area shown on the left with the circles and the numbers, this was derived from a study done back in 2011 or 12, identifying the hot spots within Mason Creek area. And that number 7 area is the area that we addressed as our very first project on the Dick Morris farm. Since then, we've had many different projects that we've engaged in downstream of that. But on the right is the Mason Creek as it flows into North Lake. And you can see how this creek is very flashy. It's got tremendous load, sediment load at times. And this picture was taken in June, I think, of 2015. Next slide. Okay, so moving from monitoring, Chris, do we have any questions for that section at all?
You know, we do. I'll say there's a couple that I'll save for the end, but there's one specifically for total phosphorus concentration. Are you reporting May through October median value or average value to WDNR?
Okay, so for those 6 months, the sampling is done on the 15th of every month so that we have a definite day that the sampling is done so that it can't be influenced by somebody's judgment saying, hey, we just had a rainfall event, we're not going to sample. Those samples must be taken on the 15th within 1 day before or after, if it falls in a weekend, let's say. So it's not an average sample or not an average of many samples during that month. It's on that 15th of the month. And that's how it's structured in the adaptive management plan.
Tom, if I could jump in real quick, all the samples that are collected 1 through 18 are reported to DNR on a monthly value basis starting of October of 2020.
Okay, thanks. All right, so moving on then, I wanted to talk about our lakes in the watershed, and I'm going to use 2 lakes to give you some examples of what's going on and what can happen in these different lakes. So we're going to talk about Freeze Lake, which is up in the northern end of the watershed, and we're going to talk about North Lake. Next slide. So Freeze Lake in Washington County is, I believe, 120 acres approximately. It has a small lake that follows it, which is Little Freeze Lake. You can see it here. And it basically receives the flow from the Oconomowoc River coming from the north. And north of that, just a little ways, is where the Connie River joins with the Oconomowoc River. Next slide. So here's the location of the lake. Next slide. So March 15th, 2019, we had a pretty significant runoff event, early meltdown. So we did sampling at Holy Hill Road, Highway 167, and at Hubertus Road to kind of look at what's happening on both sides of Freeze Lake. And you can see the dramatic difference between the inlet and the outlet of Freeze Lake. 0.543 milligrams per liter phosphorus versus 0.22. So another good example of what a filter, that Freeze Lake is, and that most of our lakes are. Next slide. So we went from that point, we said, hey, let's look at the inlet, let's look at the deep hole in Freeze Lake, let's look at the outlet and do some sampling in the lake itself. So next slide. So on April 7th of 2019, we had 0.21 phosphorus coming in the deep hole, which is kind of off to the side when you look at the flow path through the lake. Our phosphorus was 0.04, and at the outlet, it was 0.06. So again, a dramatic difference in phosphorus. And Secchi readings, you can see you've got a Secchi tube reading of 1.5 feet at the inlet, 3 feet the deep hole, and then the Secchi reading at the outlet was 4.5 feet. So this lake, I will tell you, has a delta at the inlet where sediment has been building up for decades, literally. And that Secchi reading of 1.5 feet is basically right at the transition from water to silt. You can see it. You can let your Secchi disc float down and it'll rest on top of the silt. So there's a delta at the beginning of this lake, and it's a good example of why some lake districts start talking about dredging, because there's a tremendous amount of sediment that builds up at the inlets. Next slide. So to give you a feel for what the values are and how it looks graphically, I put this together to show the April 19th sampling. That's in orange, the May 2020, July 23rd, 2020, and then September 2020. So in 2020, we did actually spring, summer and fall sampling to look at what was going on. And you can see the difference from the inlet to the deep hole and then the outlet. But the encouraging thing here is that the reduced levels coming into the lake do translate to reduced levels going out, even though the outlet is much, much clearer than the inlet on a regular basis. So Freeze Lake is one of those great examples of what the filtering capacity is of our lakes. However, we have to remember, though, that filtering capacity is only good for a certain amount of time. Eventually, these lakes will saturate and become eutrophic because the pounding every year of nutrients will eventually build up and translate into excessive weed growth and decomposition and dissolved oxygen levels that just won't support the fisheries. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about North Lake, a little different situation, but also a very interesting story for 2020. Next slide. This lake is 450 acres, roughly speaking, and it consists of a large lake and a small lake separated by a bar. And you can see that it's located pretty much in the middle of the watershed. Next slide. What's interesting about it is there's many inputs to North Lake, and it's like everything comes together into North Lake at this point. So if you want to separate the upper half from the lower half in the watershed, it's interesting that North Lake is almost like the bottom of a funnel for 4 different inputs. And the bottom, the south tributary from Cornell Lake, actually takes water from Pine Lake and from Beaver Lake. So there's a lot of different sources flowing into North Lake. Lake Keesis flows into North Lake. There's a couple different lakes up on the Little Oconomowoc River, Murphy Lake. Smaller lakes, but all making up that group of 17. So next slide, please. So Lisa has a question. Chris, do you want to address that right away?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'm gonna bring that up.
I'll read it out loud. I'm concerned the dip in phosphorus in the river as it travels through the lakes means that the phosphorus is staying in the lakes and degrading them in the process.
Okay, so exactly, and that's what I was talking about in terms of the lakes being filters. They're great for reducing phosphorus as we go through the watershed, but that time frame is finite, and those lakes are taking the hit basically in excessive weed growth and moving those lakes towards the eutrophication state. So Lisa, you're exactly right. It's a great thing to look at in the immediate future, but long-term, that's not what we want to have happening. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so I want to give you a timeline here for things that really set the table for what happened in North Lake in August. So going back to our precipitation, again, only a couple inches over average in 2015. Precipitation continues to climb though. In 2017, we had a 3rd consecutive wet year. Groundwater tables are climbing at this point. In 2018, we had our record precip 10 inches plus over normal, 4th consecutive year. And our groundwater tables are very high at this point. We also had a January melt off that caused a tremendous amount of erosion. So when you have groundwater tables that are running this high, what happens is that even small amounts of rainfall cause problems because there's no place for the rain to go. So in 2019, our precip fell, but it was still 6 inches over normal. 5th year in a row for wet conditions. Localized flooding, groundwater tables are still high. Another January, February melt causing runoff. And some conditions that were affecting our lakes. So finally in 2020, as I mentioned before, the rainfall drops, but our groundwater, generally speaking, stayed high throughout the year. We had another early season melt off in March. So in July, we saw temperatures rise ambiently, and in August, we had some very hot temperatures. Our stream flows drop to minimum, our water temperatures rise to levels we haven't seen in years. Next slide. So we're going to crunch up that time frame up in the top part, and we're going to talk about 2020 again. So we had low incoming flows into North Lake, which actually helped the water temperatures climb. Sunlight penetration. As you know, we had a great late July, great August. People were just thrilled. A lot of water skiing, a lot of water activity. You know, this is lovely weather, but it's causing increasing water temps in the lakes. So with the rising temperatures, dissolved oxygen drops. Fisheries suffer due to depleted oxygen in their desired temperature zones in the lake. So next slide. So unfortunately, North Lake saw a fish kill occurring I believe, starting in early August, but this is the DO measurements that were taken on August 21st in the deep hole. And it demonstrates how the fish really are caught between a rock and a hard place because they love high DO levels, but those high DO levels are in water now that is too warm. So fish have this desire to be in cooler water temperatures. But as you can see on this table, when you get down below 17.5 feet, the dissolved oxygen drops to 1.83 in this case, which is well below what most fisheries require. But that's their area that they like in terms of temperature. So they get squeezed. And as a result, the fish kill in North Lake was pretty dramatic. Cisco, 150 plus fish were counted. So this is an example of what can happen in a crazy year like 2020, where you would think that, okay, the rainfall has dropped. We're looking better this year. We've got great temperatures, a lot of sunlight. However, this is kind of like a perfect storm that happened for North Lake. And is an example of how these different circumstances can all line up and cause some real problems. So I wanted to bring this to your attention as just an example of what can happen in our lakes. Next slide. So this is a trophic state graph, which is available for most lakes in the state as a result of our Citizen Lake Monitoring Network database. And anyone can go into the DNR's site and look up a lake and find this graph. And it's a great tool to look at what's happening in our lakes. And you can see, I'm going to reduce this pane over here. You can see in the latter years here, 2017, 2018, 19, 20, that they were all elevated compared to 2016. And if you go back, you can even look at 2012 where we had the drought, and then the following years that were wet in that case. So on this graph, the green represents chlorophyll, the blue represents phosphorus, and the black represents Secchi disk readings. And these are plotted on this graph, not their exact values, but an index which references their trophic state. So mesotrophic zone, which is the smallest zone on this graph, is the sweet spot. So most lakes do very well when they're in this mesotrophic zone. Oligotrophic zone, below that, is a very, very clear lake. But generally speaking, when lakes are that clear, their fisheries aren't as happy because their bottom is generally fairly clear. They don't have as much structure. And so the sweet spot is the mesotrophic zone. The eutrophic zone above that is where we really start having trouble, and we have too much algae growing. We have plant growth that is excessive. A lot of lakes do a lot of weed cutting to try to eliminate that. So this is an example of a lake that's kind of on that border of mesotrophic to eutrophic. Next slide. So this is North Lake, and again, it's on that border, and you can see the cyclic pattern here. I don't have the years below on this one I can see, but it's the same thing. It cycles with the weather. Next slide. So you can also go into the DNR site and look at the Secchi readings that were taken by the Citizen Monitoring Group. And this gives you a good example. In 2020, North Lake's average Secchi reading was 5 feet. So that means that when they dropped their Secchi disk into the water, their average visibility was 5 feet. As opposed to 2019, it was 14 feet. So it's interesting how this varies, and of course, a lot of things affect that, including sunlight. Next slide. So I'm going to call this Lake Pea Soup. The real name will go unmentioned, but this is an example of a lake that is really into the trophic state or eutrophic state. And you can see how the chlorophyll, the SECU2 readings were low. This is a lake where you, if you're fishing, sometimes you have to drop your line twice because it doesn't go through the algae mat that's on the surface the first time. So this is an example of a lake that's really into that eutrophic zone and has some real issues. Next slide. All right, that's it for my monitoring section and lakes. If there aren't any questions at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Daryl.
Thanks, Tom. Really helpful to get that very thorough overview of the water quality issues throughout the river and also the lakes. We're aware our goal was to wrap up by around 1, and we've got 2 short sections left to talk a little bit about our partners and also to give you an idea of what we're planning on doing moving forward. We're going to wrap this up pretty quickly and then actually move right into our Q&A rather than having a break. You may have been spending your lunchtime with us and maybe needing to move on to other things. So again, feel free to log off and catch the recording towards the end if you need to. But we wanted to, next slide, please. Thanks several people, several organizations. Tall Pines we've mentioned as a very significant partner, and other organizations on this slide have been very significant participants, whether they're providing expertise, advising us, advising landowners, providing data and measurement help, funding, or even retailers that have supported events. So I just want to give a shout out to all of them. The next slide, we have a more comprehensive list of all the partners. County land conservation departments have been very helpful and supportive of our program, other nonprofits and businesses. So a big thanks to all of them. It's not a single action kind of work. It's, as you can tell, multi-level in terms of city and lake and river areas that we're working on. So next slide, please. We want to also give a big thanks to the Oconomowoc wastewater treatment plant staff. They do a lot of testing. As Tom has mentioned, that's how we can measure our success and monitor how we're doing, and also is what our adaptive management program will ultimately be measured by, and we need to be able to demonstrate progress towards over 5-year intervals. So we are appreciative of the lab staff and the entire wastewater treatment plant staff that is allowing and supporting this program, which is housed within the plant structure. So next slide. Farmers for Lake Country, countless volunteer hours of individuals being part of trainings to learn about soil health, to share knowledge, to volunteer for various special events. So we thank them all for being part of that. Other agricultural organizations and companies that have helped with supplies, with seed, with equipment, and so forth. So thank you to all of them. And to DATCAP, the Department of Ag, which has been a very key supporter of us. Next slide, please. The mud chasers are our eyes and ears across the watershed. When you have a 46-mile, if I'm not mistaken, or anyways, I forget all the numbers, but a long watershed, and it's impossible for us, any one of us, to keep our eyes on any one part. So having volunteers who live close to those areas and are able to monitor water quality and give real-time feedback is very helpful for us. So thank you to all the mud chasers. Next slide. Looking ahead, I would like to give you a teaser of what's to come. So next slide. There is still work to be done. So we would like in the agricultural areas to reduce fall tillage as much as possible. Both of these are photos from our watershed. So where somebody tilled their fields in the fall very close to a waterway and allowed actually soil to fall in. And even areas where we have buffers already, sometimes they need to be expanded because there's still some sediment that's able to travel across those grass buffers in periods of increased precipitation. So even under best management practices, there's still improvements. We can see those, we monitor it, and then we can actually make changes and expand the work or find a better solution within a given parcel of land. Next slide. We, in Farmers for Lake Country, have gotten some funding from DATCAP, the Department of Ag, to try our hand at some additional practices. So actually interseeding corn, putting in types of cover that grow in between the corn stalks and add to the canopy or add to the residue and help to prevent water from impacting the soil surface and running off so readily when the corn is particularly young. And also when it gets harvested, these plants are right there ready to pick up the sunlight from the immediate sun that strikes them in the fall. Next slide. We plan to do some crimping of cover crops. So rather than applying an herbicide to terminate a cover crop, using a roller crimper, which is pulled or pushed by a tractor, you allow the cover crop like rye or wheat to get to a particular height that it's got a strong stem. And so that when you hit it, it bends and it breaks and it actually terminates from that impact. While underneath that, the cash crop has already been planted. And when the rye lays down, the sunlight is able to reach the cash crop. And then below you can see what that looks like. Again, providing really critical cover during the early season, late May, early June timeframe when we have seen some runoff issues. Next slide. Here you can see Dennis mentioned trying more frost seeding, and you can see how something that was planted even at the time with snow on the ground germinates fairly early in the growing season and creates a nice fuzzy carpet of green material. And even in a wet field like you see on the right, that's a spring situation with early spring rains and a lot of water in the watershed. And just having that small cover helps to stabilize soil and absorb nutrients before they get into the surface water. Next slide, please. And John Kepke, who's pictured here, has played a nice innovative role within our watershed. And we experimented with a chaos garden where we actually blended cover crops with vegetable crops that could be planted in late summer and early fall. So it became a free pick garden plot where we're both preventing runoff and also allowing folks just to come by during kind of a tough year and pick to their heart's content as far as kale and beans, peas, and so forth, just along some acreage. And in between that is residue left over from a wheat harvest, just leftover wheat that sprouted. Next slide. And ultimately, we need to keep sharing knowledge. And soil health has become a really important topic. It is discussed all the time in ag conferences that I go to. It's the profile of soil health and the benefits to everyone are starting to be discussed, and strategies that are, were unheard of 10 years ago are now being implemented. Next slide. We believe the future is bright. Whether you have a paddle enthusiast like Tom and his canoe there, or just enjoying some of the winter landscape, the watershed, there are a lot of threads that are coming together. We feel good about the progress that's been made so far, and we're hoping we can really ramp that up with improvements from things that we've learned the first 5 years. And next slide. We do have a newsletter, and we'd like to get your input as far as how you'd like to how you would like us to stay in touch with you. So we actually have a poll question I believe Chris has that he can put up on the screen. Really would like to get other folks' input about how you would like us to communicate with you. Next slide. And you can answer the poll or ignore it as you wish. But the contact information for each of us, there are many folks behind the scenes that all have been part of our work. But if you have particular questions for Kevin at the wastewater treatment facility, for Tom as our ongoing watershed advisor, for myself, in particular about agricultural projects or volunteering even, or Susan related to longer term conservation easements or stream bank projects that will need funding, and lots of volunteer opportunities where we're actually doing some direct installation of tree planting or restoration work. So please do reach out to us. And I think what we're going to do is move into our Q&A section and save the videos, the fun fun stuff to the very, very end for those who would like to stay on longer still. But we'll move into a Q&A, and Chris is going to play a role. We'll probably ask him to take the lead here and serve the role of kind of organizing some of those questions and posing them to the different speakers that presented material. And thanks to everyone for spending your lunchtime with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daryl, and thanks everybody for sticking with us for this just over 2 hours. I've got that one poll, poll number 5, up in front of you right now. Due to time, we chose to hold back on the other polls, but I'm going to close this one in probably about 5 seconds here. And it looks like we've tapered off with our answers, so I'll end that poll. And just really quickly, I'm going to throw up these other 2 polls just so we can get this information. This question that I will launch right now is a follow-up to the very first question that we asked, which is, what is your observation of the water quality in our watershed? Is it improving, declining, staying the same, or you don't know? This is a question as to how are you making that assessment? River stream water quality clarity, aquatic life, lake water quality clarity, or lake aquatic life. And I'll leave that up for about 10-15 more seconds. And then I did get a lot of really good questions. I've done my best to try to categorize them so we can lump similar questions together. I'll close this poll in about 5 seconds and we'll move to the last polling question. That's tapered off, thank you. And then this is the, we wanted to kind of understand who's watching the presentation. Click as many as you might be associated with. And how about while you guys are answering that one, I'll throw some of these questions up. So John submitted a question early on that may have been answered, but just to touch on it to make sure it got answered, is regarding the monitoring. Are we taking additional readings? We mentioned that we're taking the primary reading for compliance at that one point, but are we taking additional readings upstream and specifically north of North Lake? Tom, do you want to answer that?
Yes. As I mentioned in the map that showed all the different black triangles, we are sampling every month on the 15th at many different locations up into the watershed, all the way up into the headwaters. So the answer to that is yes. And that's where those plots come from, where I showed the values of phosphorus in the headwaters and as they flow down through the lakes and then flow to the confluence. So every month there is a lot of samples coming into the lab, both from baseline monitoring and from the event monitoring that's going on, as well as from our mud chasers. So there's a lot of data being collected.
Thanks, Tom. I'm monitoring the chat at the same time to see if there's any new stuff, follow-ups to these. Okay, so the rest of these kind of fall into 2 categories. So we'll just start with this one. It says, for Tom, is the city doing any sampling to document the improvements associated with the bioretention areas?
Not that I'm aware of. We know, though, for a fact that, for example, with the Fowler Lake parking lot, the water from Fowler Lake's parking lot basically flowed off of that parking lot in a sheet flow pattern directly into the lake prior to that project. Now that water is being directed towards these bioretention areas where it's allowed to seep into the ground and receive that treatment prior to going into the groundwater table. So I'm not saying that there's no sheet flow coming off that parking lot, but now there's a lot of flow being captured in those bioretention areas. I don't have any data before and after, however.
Similar subject of this next question from Rick. It was interesting to see that the Fowler Lake bioretention areas seemed elevated above the parking lot. How does stormwater get into these bioretention areas?
Okay, so there's inlets along the curb lines, basically, where that water is allowed into those bioretention areas. So even though you didn't see them in the photos, the water is flowing off the pavement into those curb sections. And then there's inlets along the curb section.
Okay. Has Oconomowoc had any success getting private funding for projects from, for example, Trout Unlimited or others? That's from John.
Daryl, do you want to handle that one or should I?
Sure, I can chime in and say yes. For example, Pheasants Forever has been a very active partner in a few of the prairie plantings, providing supplemental funding that was needed to really take some of the projects up another notch. And I'm trying to remember if Trout Unlimited has supported a project yet financially. I don't recall, but they've been very helpful in terms of advising us on the importance and types of habitat that's needed. I'm very supportive of the work we're doing, for example, in Mason Creek. Tom, are you aware of that in particular as a funding source from TU?
I don't think we've seen funding yet, but there's a lot of involvement from Trout Unlimited. We've also seen funding coming from some private businesses in the city and some nonprofit agencies, even outside of the city, that have funded our projects.
Okay. Here's one specifically regarding the Mason Creek project in relation to one slide that came up. What does removing culverts do? From Lynn.
Yeah, so in this case, the culvert is inhibiting some fish passage, and it was something that was recommended in order to eventually re-meander. You needed to remove some of the literal physical obstructions that were going to be in the way. In this case, they were degrading, rusting, and so they needed to be removed. And Mark helped us remove a surprising amount of metal from the stream. In other cases where culverts are perched, where they're literally too high, or the bottom of the creek has dropped over time, it becomes a bridge that fish can't cross. And so it's a barrier towards aquatic life just moving throughout the stream. And that's another thing. And we wouldn't necessarily be trying to remove that culvert. We'd be trying to drop it or address it in other ways. Some of those we haven't been able to get to yet.
We've also seen situations where culverts are too small in their size, and when we have a stream flow that's trying to get through that area, it actually washes out the ground around the culvert, causing erosion. So in that case, the culvert's a real problem.
Yes.
Okay, so the next group of questions generally relate to the agricultural projects that we talked about, specifically for Dennis. Dennis, how do you feel about entering into 10-year commitments with the municipality when you have ever-changing conditions to adjust to?
Well, there's always changing conditions, that's for sure. Most of my land is rented property, so I'd have some problems with committing that way. I'm committed to taking care of our soils and stuff, but to sign contracts on rented ground is always kind of a problem.
And then a follow-up also to Dennis. Dennis, I would also be interested to know if you accept biosolids from the Oconomowoc wastewater treatment plant.
No, I don't. It doesn't really fit into my plan with the no-tilling and stuff like that. So I don't.
Okay, and this question might be for you, Tom. Is it okay? This refers to your slide with the outlier of the August 2020 data point. Is it possible that the August 2020 total phosphorus number is related to a particular agricultural practice in the area? That's from Janet.
Okay, we've taken a look at that to really flesh out whether that's a possibility or not. And the answer to that is no. We have very little inlets and suspicious areas down in that spot. In fact, we have some best management practices installed in that area. And actually, historically, we've also looked back during time periods where we've had similar flow conditions and weather conditions, and we've seen the same thing happening. We also had a monitoring program, which we have discontinued, that was looking at measuring flows and concentrations throughout some key points in the watershed. And during that rather brief time period, they basically told us that there's too much backwater at Northside Drive, that you can't get accurate numbers. So all these little bits of information in this data is pointing towards the rock really influencing that confluence sampling point during certain parts of the year.
So a follow-up question that I guess just came to my mind is, in any of the measurements, do we see a relative link, I guess, to any particular time of season as far as what the farmer would be doing in that time of season? Does that make sense? So we see total suspended solids go up in association with tillage. What about phosphorus?
Yes, definitely. Phosphorus is always related to the sediment that is found. There's phosphorus that's attached to the sediment. There's also soluble phosphorus. But the seasons of the year, as Daryl mentioned, May and June are really tough months of the year because we've got rainfall falling on fields that are either just planted or plants are just germinating, just coming out of the ground. There's just so little protection. So we see a real relationship between what's happening on the ag field community versus water quality issues.
Okay, and the last question that we have, I'll just read it and you guys can decide who's going to answer it. How can you reach out to the watersheds that are just beyond your boundaries to help them reduce the phosphorus before it gets to the waterways that we do monitor? For example, if the neighboring community has phosphorus contributions, wouldn't it be beneficial to enlist support from those communities too? Seems like your efforts could be compromised without their support.
Great question. In fact, I will tell you that our watershed is used by farmers outside of the watershed. So for instance, manure hauling and spreading is done in the Oconomowoc watershed and originates from farms that are outside of the watershed. So in those cases, we've actually worked with some of those farmers and have done best management practices on some of those fields that are in the watershed. As far as influencing the areas around our watershed, we do network with a lot of the watershed managers around our watershed. We have done some joint meetings where we've held educational sessions and we've invited neighboring watershed groups. And we've also participated in their programs when they've offered educational opportunities. But as far as real hard influences on what's going on in neighboring watersheds, it's tough because we technically don't have authority to do anything hard and fast, even in our own watershed. When we see issues happening in the Oconomowoc watershed, we can approach landowners, we can approach municipalities, but it's not like we've got a real strong arm of authority. So a lot of it is education and basically working with landowners and working with municipalities to do the right thing by encouraging and educating those folks on what will be the best long-term solutions. So it's tough to have a real big influence on surrounding watersheds, I guess is the bottom line.
I would add too that we have done some things in collaboration. So for example, when we are working with a helicopter company to do spreading of cover crops, one of our farmers farms in our watershed and an adjacent watershed, and we coordinate that application at the same time, which helps sort of organizing and keep costs manageable. And also other producer-led counties. Dodge County is a really active producer-led group, and there's some nice cross-pollination of ideas, and in a sense, some positive peer pressure and idea sharing there. So I think that's a nice feature of working outside or with watershed.
So I think right now, that was the last question that was submitted via chat. So right now would be an interesting time to share the results of this particular poll, because this is the poll, what groups are you affiliated with? And the number one out of 4 of you that responded out of 33 responses is an owner of property in the watershed. So a key partner. The next highest was either a partner organization or described yourself as other. And in the chat, some of those folks that describe themselves as other are Regional Planning Commission staff, Wisconsin DNR, wastewater utility, Madison, and then another municipal wastewater treatment plant using adaptive management. So we have a really diverse group of participants in this, and B, the predominant number of you are owners of land in the watershed. And I think after that, we'll pass it back to either Daryl or Tom or somebody else, and you can wrap it up.
Yeah, I guess if there aren't any other chat questions, or if there are real specific ones that someone wants to dive deeper into, you can contact us individually. We do have some videos to share from planting, from helicopter cover cropping, also a nice video on a tall pines easement that's been produced. So you're welcome to stay tuned, but I'm not seeing any other chat questions pop up. So I guess I want to extend a real appreciation to everyone who's been on the call, for all the presenters, for people sticking around for a long time, just staring at a screen. It's not our ideal way of relating, but it's what we have at this moment. So thank you all, and to Chris and Beth with Tall Pines for being our IT gurus behind the scenes and keeping us moving through this. Really very much appreciate your help. So is any other presenter want to add anything, or are we good to go?
Good. Thanks, Daryl.
Okay.
Good.
So we can cue the videos then, and everyone have a great day, and look forward to continuing to work together.
All right.
Beth, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm not seeing anything running on this side. Sometimes in my Zoom, I have to stop screen share and restart whenever I'm starting a new application. Don't know if that might be at play here. I'll jump in. I think I've unmuted myself. The video supplied by the helicopter company called Recon Helicopters. They're out of East Troy, and they help us by spreading the cover crops on a standing crop, which allows the seed to have a head start and getting germinated and established before the wintertime. We'd like to do this on standing soybeans, if at all possible, right around the time that the soybeans turn to a golden brown and before leaf drop. So this is sort of a good example of how we do what we do from a cover crop perspective. The pilot has to manage several factors. The seed is spun out of the hopper that you can see hanging from the helicopter. So they're managing height, travel speed, also any kind of side wind issues. And then they basically paint the field and try to do it as even of an application of seed as possible. Approximately 60 pounds of rye or wheat seed we're applying to the acre. So this was a video they put together with drone footage. of that process. We have some other videos as well. This was the start of the same video. Dennis, I don't know if there's something you want to add to this narration.
Well, I could add that the helicopter has a GPS system in, so they can paint lines right on the field, and they can tell exactly where they've been. Over the years, they've become better and better at this, and they don't have as many skips anymore. And I mean, it is a cover crop, so if there's a little skip, it's not a big deal. But they do a pretty remarkable job for going as fast as they do over a field.
One of the key benefits is that the farmer doesn't have to worry about doing the application at a time when they're really busy doing harvest or preparing for harvest. And also, we're not limited by ground conditions. So if we've had recent rain and it's very wet, that's fine. You don't have to worry about tracking across a field and making it muddy and compacted. The helicopter can take care of it, and it is actually a quicker application process than drilling it. Some people might say drilling could get a little better stand and quality and evenness of stand, but that requires a tractor and it takes a slower process. And this way we're able to get 2,000 acres done over a matter of a couple days.
Yeah, that's the key right there. I know the one day we were doing on my farm, it was 800 acres, I think we covered in that one day.
That's right.
If I'm out there with the drill, it's a lot slower.
It certainly is not the only way to do it, but it's just one way to get our goals accomplished.
Exactly.
I don't know if you're able to maybe move to some of the next videos. There could be videos of Dennis planting green, if that's available. I don't know what's like on your end, Beth, to find what's needed. Right now we're seeing the helicopter.
We are working on getting this next video queued up here. Sorry, guys.
I'll add that one of the cool things about our process is that we can actually grow the seed that we are planting. So Dennis actually grew a lot of the rye that he then used as a cover crop so you can, in relatively small acreage, grow enough seed to apply to many larger acreage, much larger acreage. So it's a nice process. We have also purchased seed from local companies. At times it can be tough to get cover crop seed because it's in such demand now, which I guess is a really good thing. So rye in particular is sought after because it's able to be planted so late in the season and still get some growth out of it. It can germinate almost down to freezing temperatures. Feel free to interrupt me, Chris.
Yeah, no, we're gonna unshare Beth's screen and then share my screen, and I've got the Meyer video queued up here.
Okay.
All right, I'll talk to you in a little bit. Sorry, I forgot to mute myself after I was talking to Beth there. All right, where is it? There it is. Are you getting audio from that?
We're not.
No.
Susan, do you want to, you've probably seen this video many times. Do you want to add any narration here?
It would really be nice if we could hear it. So this is Ike Meyer. Ike and Shelley Meyer own this farm that I spoke about, before. And they're 7. Oh, all right. Here we go.
How about now?
Magic. Uh-oh.
Let's take it back to the beginning.
His brother.
Are you getting
Before
audio?
that, my grandfather farmed all through the 20s and on. They farmed right here. My great-grandfather was right here in this area. The church here at the corner is Myers Church. So
Meyer.
Yeah.
Okay, not Mayer.
Sometimes we say mayor, then they get a better chance of spelling it right. There's a lot of ways to spell it. It's something that you grow up with and something that you've been a part of. I enjoy milking and breeding good cattle. It's been a good life, and we promise the opportunity to our kids if they wanted it. With some grandchildren present now, we're getting to that point where we've got a transition in mind and a way for it to be possible.
We are so excited to be working with the Meyer family on a conservation easement. This beautiful area is experiencing a lot of development pressure. It's only 40 minutes from Milwaukee, and land prices are actually skyrocketing here. The Meyers were able to use the funding from purchase of development rights to help their kids stay in farming.
We looked at it as this would ensure that it stays in agriculture. Tall Pines was committed to it, and we got it done.
This land protection project really was the result of a multifaceted partnership. John Kepke of Farmers for Lake Country made the connection between Tall Pines and the Meyers. We brought in the Oconomowoc Watershed Protection Program to work with the Meyers on best practices.
This location is approximately 1/3 downstream from the headwaters, where the Connie Creek actually starts to drain the northern area of the watershed. In the Connie Creek area, we have quite a few farms that we're working with, including Ike and Shelley Meyer, and we've just completed 2 projects with them, one being a perpetual easement and the other one being a perennial cover crop on a field that was highly erodible.
The involvement of Tall Pines has made this whole concept of transitioning to the next generation a lot more feasible.
We're thrilled that we could do something like this for the family and for the watershed. It just all came together.
We're very happy. We're glad that we worked with them. We have a lot of gratitude to their organization.
So I think that's the last video that we have queued up. Is that true?
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
So I think what we talked about offline, not in front of everybody, is that I think when we send the recording link out, we'll include links to the videos that we had otherwise queued up for this part of the presentation. So you can all
Great.
prepare to watch those on your own time.
Okay, so I think we're wrapped up then, and appreciate everyone staying online and being part of this. And I guess we'll sign off. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good day.